I'm going to read a column from The Independent, which is about a subject that I have very strong views on. Bear with me, it's not very long, but I do want to read it to give you the whole context here. Government's back to work law ruled illegal by High Court. Emergency legislation introduced by the government after its flagship back to work schemes were ruled legally flawed was yesterday itself judged illegal by the High Court. Mrs. Justice Lang said the retrospective legislation brought in by the government to deal with previous unfavourable court ruling was incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. Human rights lawyers said the judgment was a damning assessment and, if upheld on appeal, could lead to some 130 million being paid out to thousands of job seekers allowance claimants denied benefits under the schemes. The Department for Work and Pensions said it would appeal the ruling. The back-to-work schemes have been condemned by critics as slave labour because they involve work without pay. However, they are seen by supporters as a good way of getting the unemployed back to work. The DWP brought in retrospective legislation to overcome flaws identified by three appeal judges in a case involving Poundland. The appeal judges unanimously agreed that the 2011 regulations failed to give the unemployed enough detailed information, especially about sanctions, including loss of job seekers' allowance for refusing jobs under the schemes. The appeal ruling was a victory for university graduate Kate Riley, 24, from Birmingham, who challenged having to work for free at a local Poundland discount store. But the government pushed for emergency regulations to enable the schemes to continue and block attempts to claw back lost benefits. In the High Court, Miss Riley's lawyers argued that the new regulations were employed by a cynical government to make lawful in retrospect what senior judges had declared unlawful and avoid the consequences of its flawed actions. Mrs. Lang said the doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament, and it goes on to that's bureaucrat language after that. Okay, so basically what Mrs. Justice Lang is saying is that the government's actions are illegal. And just to be clear, this is the Supreme Court of England and Wales. So it's High Court of England and Wales. I've always hated Workfare, having personally experienced it. So it is encouraging to see that it is officially illegal. It's not just a moral opposition, but it is actually officially illegal. The government is breaking the law. If you don't know what Workfare is, basically it's a scheme. By the way, it didn't begin with the Cameron government, because when I went through it, it was the Brown government. So it isn't a Tory thing. New Labour done it as well, shamefully. Basically, Workfare is a scheme whereby unemployed people are forced to work for no pay in order to bring down unemployment statistics in favour of the government. People are forced under the scheme after a certain period of time, claiming out of work benefits. I think it's between 5 and 6 months, I don't know exactly. When I done this, it was way back in 2009. That was one of the most soul-destroying and unpleasant experiences of my life. Now, there's a few points I'd like to make. Right-wing tabloid rags like the Daily Mail and the Sun have sneered at this young woman, Kate Riley, for defending herself, and they've had this sort of vindictive slandering of her, basically, in their coverage of Workfare. All this young woman has done is try to defend herself from exploitation, which is basically what Workfare is. Now, I wouldn't have such a problem with it if the people forced under the scheme were actually paid. But the point about this is they're not paid. It's forced unpaid labour. You can't gloss it over any other way. Now, you do continue to receive job seekers allowance, but that does not correlate with a salary at all. It's basically like expenses, and actually part of the job seekers allowance you need to use for transport. So they don't sort of evaluate like the transport taken out of it. I suspect 99% of the people who support Workfare have never been through it themselves. If you think that the government really cares about young unemployed people, that's delusional. What they do care about is statistics and what looks good. They couldn't care less how people feel on the scheme, because if they did, the part of the system would be enabling unemployed people to have a voice. But the system basically bullies unemployed people into the scheme, and it's a worse sort of blackmail. It's basically saying, either you do this, you accept being exploited, or we'll take away the benefits, which is not a word I like, by the way. I prefer to call it welfare, because benefits implies that it's free money, and believe me, it's not free money. There's many obligations. But anyway, that is insinuation I think that supporters have, that, and it actually boils down to something. This has got nothing to do with helping unemployed people. Let's be very clear about that. It is not about helping unemployed people. It's got everything to do with punishing unemployed people, because I suspect in the Brown years it was because the Brown government had to please the tabloid press. This was before phone hacking. They were still extremely powerful. And in the case of the Cameron government, I suspect it's because they're ideologically aligned with the gutter press. And the gutter press loves to scapegoat people who can't defend themselves. So, unemployed people, I'm not saying they can't have an opinion, but they are very, very much an underdog. And this scheme, if you think it's harmless, you know, people scoff at this idea of human rights, and the Sun this week was gobbing away about the unemployed, mentioning this and the fact that the European Court of Human Rights has been brought into it. But consider this: Workfare has driven people to suicide. I know from personal experience it made me feel terrible. It was one of the most soul-destroying experiences of my life. So, when you consider this has driven people to suicide, it's driven people over the edge, then I don't think talking about human rights should be such a taboo thing. I don't think it should be. I don't think that's an exaggeration. Now, I don't quite agree with the label slave labour. I think we need to be careful about calling it that. However, I do regard it as exploitation. The reason, by the way, I don't call it slave labour is because you can technically leave it, whereas slavery, people who are slaves can't leave their employers. So you can technically leave Workfare, but basically it's a choice of take this exploitation or you're going to be financially destitute, because you'll still be unemployed and you won't gain, you won't have any financial support from the state. So it's basically a choice of poverty or exploitation. That's not an exaggeration. That is your choice. Face exploitation or face poverty. That's what it comes down to. And this cabinet of millionaires, for them to vindictively put people in this position as punishment, not as help, as punishment, is utterly despicable. Apologists for Workfare say it's all about helping train the unemployed for work. Okay, so train them, but pay them. Because the thing about Workfare, I'm not talking about 1 hour once a week going to a factory somewhere. I'm talking about full work days. You're basically expected to do the same work as the people you're with who are regular employees, but you're not paid, and they are. I had to go and work in a furniture factory. And it wasn't a case of just observing people and sort of maybe learning some skills. It was a case of being obliged to do the same work as them. Yes, I got some training, but no payment whatsoever. So I was being expected to have a full day there with no pay. Of course it pissed me off. In the end I quit voluntarily, and yes, that meant for a long time I did struggle financially. My situation is not perfect now, although thank goodness last week I finally got a secure job. For the last 5 years, I've been struggling with self-employment. And I think it's despicable that the government claims this is about trying to help people. They will say it will give people training to get into work, but what they won't say is there's a very high proportion of claimants who drop out of it, either because they're driven over the edge and they do it voluntarily, or they have just rebelled against it and they haven't turned up, and then they've been fired from the employer. And by the way, shame on employers who do this. There's been a number of large corporations who have been named and shamed, and rightly so in my opinion, for endorsing this scheme, and they've subsequently pulled out of it because of the bad publicity. Tesco was one, and there was a host of others. I believe Boots was another one. So a lot of high street names had been involved in this scheme, and they had to pull out because of negative publicity. Look, Workfare has got nothing to do with trying to help people. Yes, you might learn some skills, which might be useful, but it is designed to punish. And I can say that because the way that the Workfare staff, I don't want to say job centre staff because this is a different group of people, and I have to say most job centre staff were pretty civil to me, but the people on Workfare are nothing but vindictive, power control bullies. I did write a letter of complaint at the time because I did not like the way some of those staff members were speaking to me and others. They would come in, they would strut into the room, talk down to us. One woman actually boasted about how good she was at her job, and I'm not exaggerating. If you see the comedy sketch, I think it was in Little Britain or apologies, I can't remember, League of Gentlemen, I think it might have been. It was one of those dark comedies. There was a sketch called Pauline at the Job Centre. It was pretty famous sketch. Now, that was pretty funny stuff, but the troubling thing is the reality is not that far off. There are a lot of people in the system, especially at the point of Workfare, who really are like that. Obviously it's a bit of a caricature, but there are vindictive bullies in the system. And technically they have a policy of everyone's treated fairly, but if you've been through the system, you will see it's incredibly biased towards the staff. As a claimant, you have almost no rights, and it's a total disgrace. You could just choose to not go in, but like I say, they then blackmail you financially. If you do that, they just cut off the money, which means you're facing poverty. So basically you're being punished for facing a challenging time in your life. Unemployment's hard enough as it is with the anxiety it creates, but basically Workfare is designed to appease ignorant tabloid morons who believe what they read about unemployed people, that they're all lazy parasites feeding off the state. They're lazy benefit scoundrels, etc. Now, I always say in these videos, I know full well there are people who abuse the system. There are people who do take it for granted that they get money from the state and who aren't trying to find work and so on. I understand that. And I understand there probably does need to be some tough approaches against those people. But Workfare is basically collective punishment. And it is basically designed to, basically in Cameron's Britain, unemployment may as well be a crime. Because in everything but name, the unemployed are treated like criminals. Meanwhile, we have a Prime Minister and a Cabinet who goes out of its way to stick up for the real parasites, in my opinion, which dominate the tabloid press. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in Cameron's so-called big society. But to bring human rights into this is not an exaggeration, because Workfare does drive people over the edge. It does. I was only there for a month, and believe me, that was long enough. So I can understand sanctions against people who really are taking the system for granted. I can understand that. But this young woman, Kate Riley, she wanted to work. She had a background in geology. She wanted to work in a museum. That's completely logical. She felt she was being forced to do work which was just counterproductive. And she has always said it's not about looking down on that type of work, which is what the despicable Daily Mail tried to distort it as. I mean, it's ironic for the Tories, and I say the Tories because the Daily Mail is a Tory paper, to actually talk about snobbery, work snobbery. Because they tried accusing people like Kate Riley of turning their nose up at that sort of work. It's not about turning her nose up. It's because she did not want to be exploited. And I think it's completely reasonable that people say they don't want to work for no money. It's different if you're doing voluntary work, because that is voluntary. Workfare is not voluntary. It's forced. In fact, I would always advocate to unemployed people, do voluntary work. It's good for your CV. But workfare is forced unpaid labour. Now, the Gutter Press often talk about things like the work shy get free money, and it's a something for nothing culture. The real something for nothing that is going on here is workfare. There is something because the unemployed are working, that's something, and there's nothing because they're not getting paid. Something for nothing. Workfare is something for nothing. And it's not a disgrace. And I really wish people who make excuses for it would just get a grasp of what it's like themselves. I've been through it. I'm not a criminal. I actively tried to find work. I done everything I was asked to do. When I went through that system, I felt like I was being spoken down to. I felt like I was being criminalised. I honestly felt like I was someone who had been a shoplifter or something. I was doing some sort of community service, because that's how they treat you. You know, rhetoric about wanting to help the unemployed is nothing but an excuse. The system is designed to be as soul destroying as possible. The government knows this, and they want to make it tough to appease the readers of The Sun and the Daily Mail and the Daily Tory Graph who vote for them. And I think it's despicable. It's the worst form of cynicism, and it makes my blood boil. So this is progressive news that it's been ruled illegal, and it just shows how vindictive and spiteful this government is, that even after there was legal question marks raised, they went out of their way to push through legislation. That shows just how spiteful men like Ian Duncan Smith are. And it's odious. And it will be a very dark shadow over Cameron's premiership. Like I say, it's not unique to this government. When I experienced it, it was in a Labour government. But workfare is despicable, as far as I'm concerned. By all means, give unemployed people training, but don't force them to work for nothing. You know, the big society is supposed to be about fairness. Well, in what rational way is forcing someone to work for no money fair? Now, people will turn around and say, oh, well, they'll still get Job Seekers Allowance. But when you do the maths on it, these people are being forced to work for a full day. When you do the maths, that amounts to something like less than a quarter of the legal minimum wage. In other words, a salary, if you want to call it that would be less than many developed countries. And that's not an exaggeration. So workfare is an abomination, and I'm pleased about this ruling. I didn't intend to make the video this long, but I have very strong views on this subject, and I'm very grateful to Kate Riley that she hasn't just stood up for herself, she has brought attention to this issue. As for despicable cowardly little rags like the Daily Mail, well, tabloids preaching about morality and being good citizens is pretty ironic.